Welcome. Today we're going to be taking a look at what we need to do to work with a mouse listener using Java. So we're going to start off with our mouse panel. That's where all of the work's going to be happening with this. And of course, we're always going to start with our imports and our work our way down to go through this. So let's go ahead and take a look at the import section first. So in my import section, I'm importing my controller because I'm using my model view controller structure that I've used with all of my projects so far. I also import JavaX.Swing, JPanel, Spring Out, and JLabel. Those are the Java Swing components we're using actually just to show things inside the actual panel we're working with. Not all the extra work. Java.awp.color. I like color. It's a lot of fun. But the stuff we're really talking about today are these three imports right here, 11, 12, and 13 for those line numbers. And so you can see right here on import java.awp.event.MouseMotionListener, java.awp.event.MouseListener, and java.awp.event.MouseEvent. And those are the three things we need to actually work with when we're talking about using a listener. Now, if you take a look at some other videos, I've been really using the idea of the lambda notation when we're talking about working with listeners, and those are wonderful. I love them for all the action listeners we can normally use when we're talking about buttons and the other events we're working when we're doing Java Swing programming. However, that's not an option when we're talking about mouse listeners. We're going to do the more standard approach for anonymous inner classes to make that work. And we'll talk more about that as we go through, though. But as you can see right here, I don't have any data members that are working with those listeners specifically. All those data members are just for the actual structure of the app itself. So I have my controller reference, I have the layout, the X label, Y label, and the mouse status label. I'm going to initialize those here inside my constructor with the appropriate values, mouse X, mouse Y, and the mouse status, so you can see what's going on with that. And then I call my three helper methods that I always use for all of my GUI projects: setup panel, setup listeners, and setup layout. Setup panel is going to be really basic. All this one's going to do is just going to assign our layout. It's going to put the X and Y labels as well as the mouse status label on the screen so they exist. And then my setup layout method, it's going to place them using the Spring Layout constraints, which we don't have to go over that. What we really want to take a look at is we've got some other methods right here. We have our setup listeners, our update position, mouse details, and update color. These are the methods that are going to be using to actually go through the code with this. So let's start with update colors because it's the least important, but it's the most fun. So update color is a method I've decided right here where I'm just going to randomly change the background color of my screen so we can see when this method fires, we can see that, oh, something has occurred on the screen. So we can easily see a reaction for this. And so we're going to use update color as a way to actually, oh, I noticed something happened. So that's what the update color does. It just randomly gets a color of red, green, and blue values, combines that together for a new color, and sets that as the background color. Not much there. Let's take a look at the update position and mouse details methods. Those are actually going to be more useful for actually see what's happening when we're talking about using a mouse listener so we can see what to do. So first one we have is private void update position. It takes a mouse event as a parameter, and it uses the most useful method inside a mouse event with the getX and getY methods, which tell us where the mouse actually is inside the app. And I use that simply to set the text of the X and Y labels. My X value is this and my Y value is that. So those labels are actually just displaying where the mouse is on screen. And it's designed so we can actually easily see that in a nice visual way. So that's what we're doing with that. So let's take a look at our mouse details method. Our mouse details method takes a string name for information as well as a parameter of a mouse event, so we can actually extract information from the mouse event we're talking about. And we assign right here a string details is going to be using HTML. We're using the HTML notation of this so I can have multi-line functionality on a J label, makes it so we can do some really cool stuff. Great way to make that happen. So I'm using mouse event and starting that with bold, then the name of the mouse event we're talking about, then a new line, and then in bold the button, and then we have the information we're going to be looking at that. As you can see right here, I'm using a if-else block sequence right here where current event.get button is if it's equal to button 1, 2, 3, or no button, so I can see what's going on with that. And if my get button does not equal that, I've got too many mouse buttons. So if you have one of those really cool nifty Mises, then we're going to have to actually not be able to capture all those button events. So we just have that right there. So just as an FYI. We then have to close our details with a backslash HTML on there so we can actually close that tag so it can properly support the HTML formatting and we're working with that. And I'm also having a system.println here just so I can see some of the more detailed information that's happening with this when we go through and actually see what happens on the console versus what we see in the actual application. And we'll take a look at that as we go through. And finally, I update my mouse status label to be setting the text for that. So those are the methods we're going to be using throughout the code as we actually through this. We want to go over the definitions of them we want to go over the implementation of those methods first so we can actually see what happens when I actually call them and use them inside the code, because that way we can just keep these methods closed out of the way and not have to worry about looking at them as we actually go see what's happening. So go ahead and collapse this out of the way as well. And we're going to go to our setup listeners method where all the work that's going to be happening to our mouse listener is going to be actually worked with. So let's go take a look at setup listeners to start off. As you can see right here, I have my setup listeners helper method, and you can see that I have two things I'm adding listeners to. I'm adding a new mouse listener and I'm adding a new mouse motion listener. And when we're doing this is the idea that we can see see what's happening when I do different things. And so I wanted to go over some of the basic ideas of what we're working with as we actually do this. And so when we're talking about a mouse listener, we've got two different things we're working with. I'm going to talk about the actual action of the mouse or the movement of the mouse. And that's what those two different things we're looking at. So let's take a look at the mouse listener first. That's that first one we have right here. And so in my add mouse listener, I have 5 methods that I have to implement. Again, because this is an interface, I have to implement all 5 methods or it won't compile, it won't work. And so I create an anonymous instance of a class of a mouse listener, and I provide the implementation for those 5 methods. Now, you'll notice that my 2 methods, mouse pressed and mouse released, I have simply an open closed set of squigs attached to them. I don't actually have any code inside there. I'm implementing them, but I'm doing nothing with it, and that's totally a-okay. It's okay to do this because of the fact implementation doesn't mean it has to actually does anything. It just has the structure, signature of the code, as well as the associated block that goes along with it. So in this case, when I do the press and release, because those 2 actions together combine to make a click, I'm doing nothing inside them, and so I just simply have a simple one-line statement with an open and closed squiggles after the parens for that method. Also notice that every one of the methods we're talking about for the listeners right here take a parameter of a mouse event, and I use the ultra creative naming convention of the, a mouse press gets a mouse event called press, mouse release gets a mouse event called release, mouse click gets click, entered equals enter, and then exited, yes, that's right, it equals exit. So I'm using just a simple name on that because that way I can easily know what I'm working with in my brain and not have to worry about I'm using some random single letter variable that we often see in demos. Ooh, I know. So we have our 3 methods we actually provided detailed implementation for. We have the mouse clicked, and so when I press the click on a mouse and do update position, passing it the click parameter that I just sent it, I'll also call the mouse details method with the click string, and then the click parameter that I just simply retrieved from the actual event, so I can use that to extract information about the actual click itself. I also have mouse entered with the same thing, where I'm going to do update position with enter, mouse details with enter and enter, and then finally update color so I can see when I enter the screen and see what happens. Versus when I do mouse exited, I have the mouse event exit where I call update position again, mouse details exit, and I give that display as well. So those are the ones we have to with that. I'm going to add some code to this for the idea of the press and release, that same approach right here with update position of click and mouse details of that. So it happens with these right here, so we can see the full amount of detail that happens with that. So I'll call update position. And so I'm just using that same approach for all those so we can actually see the full implementation of that so we can see all the results with it. It was totally fine without that, but we want to make sure we can see that here so we can see the full result when we first start this off. Then we have our MouseMotionListener. Now MouseMotionListener only has 2 methods attached to it. The mouse move, which is any action on the mouse without using a button, and mouse drag, where obviously, yes, I'm clicking and dragging. Yes, a skill you mastered long, long ago, I know. I'm using the same basic approach for that with update details, update position and mouse details for both of those as well. Again, that simply has a mouse event as a parameter, so I send that information back off with that. And then also in mouse drag, I'm also calling update color so we can see the true result of when I'm doing the drag versus what happens with that. And we can also see some of the more information with this. So that's what we have for the code. Let's go ahead and run this application, see what's going to happen, and then go a little more detail. So right here we have the application right in hand. You can see that I had that mouse event where I had the enter happen up here with no button involved. It's showing right here on the actual screen itself of the application, as well as up here in the console saying that, I had a mouse event, it was enter, and button that was involved was there's no button involved. So we're going to see what happens when I click my mouse and what happens as I do this. I have a pop-up window just simply to start this off so we can see what's going to occur with that. So I'm going to press OK, and we'll see another enter event happen immediately after this with no button involved. Yeah. So I have my button right here, and so I'm on the screen, there's no button involved. As you can see right here, every time I move the mouse, I'm repeatedly firing this, and up here in the actual console area, I have this giant pile of mouse events where it's like, no button involved, and I've got lots and lots of lines of this, loads and loads and loads. All those movements, every time I do that, it simply goes through right that. So that's where we have the idea right there, and I entered the button. I exit right that so that I have an enter, it clicks. So my move, there's no button involved. If I click right here, I press the main button. If I right click, I have the tertiary button on here. I'm using my keypad with that. And I can drag right here, and as you can see right here, I have that magical color effect right here. And so as I drag, I'm updating the mouse X and Y, but I'm also changing the actual event right there. So when I move, no change happens to the color. And we can see right here I'm using the mouse event move with no button involved. And when my mouse and X and Y values all change as I'm doing that. So those events are firing every single time I move that, and it's happening right there. As I do this over here and I drag across this, that same thing happens, and you look over in the corner of my console right here, you can see that was scrolling down. I've got lots of different button events that are all happening with that. So there's lots of drags and moves that are happening with that. Lots of stuff there. My last exit right there, clearly showing I was actually leaving the screen. I come back on, boom, there's that enter the change of the color, boom. Every time I enter, the color changes. We can see we have that happen. We don't actually see the enter show up here in the mouse event because it happens so fast as soon as it occurs. But we can see that. If I go fast enough though, you can see that I have a negative mouse X value when I move quickly out of it. Or if I go right here and I move quickly out to the other direction, I go past the size of the thing. So right here, I'm over here in that positive, I enter the screen, I move, and I'm gonna go out. And I have a negative 65 because when I stopped it, when I finally captured that information, it was outside of the bounds, and so that's where that negative 65, because again, as I go down, my Y value goes up. As I go to the right, my X value goes up. As I go to the left, my X value goes down. As I go up, my Y value goes down. And so we have that right there where my 0, 0 is in that top left corner. We can see as I do that, even if I go to that little tiny bit right here, this counts as exiting because even though I'm on the application, I'm outside of the panel's bounds, and that's where I'm attaching it to. So every time I come into the panel, the color changes. Great stuff. When I click and drag, I have that. When I right click and drag, it's a tertiary button event. You can see that that drag happens down there, so we can see that's going. My tertiary button was released. If you have a mouse, you can, any different event you're happening, will have that show as the microseconds that it's doing as it goes along with that. And so again, we're going to go ahead and take that out. We're going to comment out those 2 lines of code that we had right there for that. So we'll just go ahead and remove those lines that were attached to that, making it just back to an open and close squiggle for the press and release, because we don't really need that information in our app. And we'll rerun that app again just to show again that you don't have to have any code attached to that. And so as I go through this and I bring it back up, now they no longer have the press and release. I only have the click event that's showing up here in my console. So there's no more longer a press and release because I don't actually implement the actual code for that. I simply just have to have a stub method. That's all I need for that. And then all my events right here, you can see my mouse X and Y happen, updating all the time. That move event fires lots. We can see that happening all over the place. And so we can see that that's what's occurring with that as we go along. Now, if I take a look at this and actually go a little more detailed, let's go ahead and look at the code for that a little bit closer inside my update position and mouse details. Every time I run that, you'll see that I'm calling, every time the update position gets called, with whichever of those methods it's working with, it grabs and it sets the text on my X label, my Y label. It says, hey, current event, that mouse event we're talking about right now, get that mouse's X and Y value and attach it to the label. So that's all that's doing for those 2 methods. When we go into more detail in the mouse details method, so it's like, oh, let's see what happens when I do a mouse event like that, where which I was only going to call inside the, and I call that mouse details event as I go through all those methods as well. So whichever I'm doing. So if I click right here, oh, that happened. So that's happening for every single time I do that. Move, drag, move, click, right click. All those things that are happening with that. So it goes in here and that's where it builds that HTML result. So you can see right here that I have that mouse event colon move, and it makes it so I have that bold effect and then followed by the new line with the other bold effect attached to that so we can see what's happening. And it can tell me what button I'm working with as well, so I can use that to make that happen. And so if you do have more than 3 buttons, unfortunately the built-in library for Java doesn't support that. So if you want to actually use multiple buttons, you're gonna have to deal with that using an external library. And that there are lots of tools available for you, but unfortunately it's not going to work directly with Swing itself. So c'est la vie for that. But that's a quick way we can provide implementation for this. So again, all I have to do to attach a listener for it is I attach to the panel the mouse motion listener for handling the click and the handling the moving and the dragging. If I only care about click events and entering and exited, then I can simply attach the mouse listener for that. So depending on what you want to do, those are the listeners you'd want to do. And again, because it's an anonymous inner class, I can provide, as long as I provide implementation for all the methods and they're void methods, I can simply just return a open and closed set of squigs if I don't care about what happens with that individual event. And so that's how I can make that happen. So again, all we have to do to make a mouse listener is we have to have the appropriate imports added for that. We can't use the lambda notation because we have 5 different methods for one listener and 2 methods for the other that we have to implement. So we have to do a full-blown anonymous inner class to make that work. So that's the one small change we have to do. So it's not quite as cool as working with a button listener. But you can do all sorts of cool stuff with that, and you can definitely use this to do some really cool projects on your own using Java and Swing. I hope this is helpful for you. Cheers. Have a great day. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.